a man who falls in love with a woman at first sight, unable to stop thinking about her. But what did he see in her that made him fall so deeply, and how much does she care for him in return? Let's begin the story. In the beginning, we are introduced to a man named Timothy. He has no home of his own and wanders from place to place, setting up his bed wherever he can. He has an unusual habit of admiring beautiful women from afar. Poor Timothy survives by eating discarded food on the streets. One day, while scavenging for food, he notices a stunningly beautiful woman named Josephine heading toward a church. Timothy had never seen such a beautiful lady before. The villagers often said Josephine was the most gorgeous woman in town. Timothy instantly falls for her and begins following her. At the church, Josephine listens to a long sermon by the priest. Afterward, as she heads home, Timothy follows her discreetly, eventually discovering where she lives. Once Josephine is inside her house, Timothy climbs a tree near her home and gazes at the orange trees in her yard, imagining her. He spends the whole day on the tree, hoping that he might get a chance to meet her at night. As night falls, Timothy hides behind some leaves, waiting. Josephine, unaware of his presence, notices him from her window. Poor Timothy ends up spending hours outside, his eyes fixed on her. The next day, Josephine goes to a nearby lake to bathe. After her bath, she heads to another spot for some fresh air. She appears sad, mourning her mother who had recently passed away. Afterward, Josephine returns home and goes to bed. Meanwhile, Timothy sneaks into her house late at night and watches her sleep. This is the first time he sees her so closely. He places a butterfly on her as a gesture of admiration and then begins exploring her home. Timothy meticulously examines every room, imagining himself living there and drinking orange juice someday. Finally, he leaves the house unnoticed. The next day, Timothy knocks on Josephine's door. Her father answers and discovers that Timothy is mute and deaf. Feeling pity for him, her father invites him inside and asks the maid to serve him food. While everyone is busy, Timothy sneaks into the library and starts looking through the books, hoping to find something that will bring him closer to Josephine. Now Joseph's father feels that Timothy wants to say something, so he hands him a piece of paper. Timothy starts writing on the paper, trying to convey that he is unique. The doctor doesn't understand this. Meanwhile, night falls, and everyone gathers at the dinner table to eat. Timothy is also eating, sitting across from Joseph. However, Joseph looks very upset and avoids looking at Timothy. At that moment, a handsome man named Paul arrives. Joseph's father likes him, and Paul has a romantic interest in Joseph. Despite this, Joseph does not like Paul and has rejected his proposals several times. Paul tries to get close to her again, but Joseph ignores him. Meanwhile, Timothy is oddly touching his glass, and the doctor tries to figure out what Timothy wants to say. Timothy writes that he can see the future. The doctor realizes this is true. Timothy then writes about the beauty of beautiful people, subtly referencing Joseph, but others don't understand his point. To demonstrate his powers, Timothy picks up a knife and transforms it into a ring, leaving everyone astonished. A few moments later, he brings the knife Joseph doesn't understand, nor do the others. Timothy continues writing and reveals that he is the child of God. The next day, Joseph falls ill, and the doctor advises her to stay home. As Joseph approaches the window, she sees Timothy watching her. They stare at each other for a while. When Timothy begins approaching her, she quickly shuts the window and moves to the kitchen. Soon after, Timothy enters the house and places a ring on her finger. Joseph is too shocked to say anything, and they both sit down to eat. Sometime later, Joseph wakes up. Returning to her room, she contemplates cleaning the space. Suddenly, she notices Timothy leaving the area. Joseph feels compelled to follow him, and Timothy doesn't respond and keeps walking. Eventually, they reach a forest and find a small house. Entering the house, they meet a family. The head of the family is named Joseph. His wife is Mary, and they have a daughter. As soon as they enter, Mary helps her, giving her a dress to wear. After a while, they all sit down at the table to eat, and Timothy starts performing magic again. Everyone wonders what he is doing. After finishing the meal, everyone sends both of them to a private room and heads to another room. Mary's daughter is supposed to stay, but Joseph tells her to join the others. Mary doesn't understand what's going on. Mary asks both of them to leave her house. Mary takes her daughter to another room. Meanwhile, Mary's son is there, and Timothy tells him to take Joseph upstairs. Together, they take Joseph to an upper room. Mary tells her husband, worried that he might fall in love with that beautiful woman. The two of them travel deep into the forest and stop. Timothy goes hunting and returns with it. Seeing this, Joseph is terrified and says she will never eat it. She tries to leave, but Timothy ignores her and starts preparing his dinner. Joseph eventually returns. The next morning, when Joseph wakes up, they move on from there, and Joseph asks Timothy some questions, but he does not respond. She stays with Timothy. Over time, Timothy starts receiving her affection. Joseph knows that she cannot escape escape Timothy, so she begins waiting for the right moment. Gradually, they move forward. One day, while they are traveling, some thieves attack them, steal their bags, and Timothy gets injured. Seeing this, Joseph realizes that Timothy has no special powers and is not a divine being. He is just pretending. They both leave and reach a village. They sit down to eat, and Joseph thinks she needs to fake something to get rid of Timothy. She starts dancing and brings Timothy along with her. While dancing, she kisses him to make him believe that she loves him. Later that night, Joseph suggests another act. After this, they return to the forest. The next morning, Joseph notices that Timothy is still asleep, and she thinks this is the right time to escape. She gets up and runs away. After a while, she reaches a house and knocks on the door. Two people open the door, and Joseph tells them everything. She repeatedly asks them to send word to her father. Meanwhile, Timothy is searching for her and arrives at the house. He enters and says, "These two men will harm you, so listen to me and leave with me." After this, both of them run away from there and start bathing in a lake. Then, Josephine comes to the edge of a cliff and says, "If you are truly a child of God, save me." Josephine says, "You are not a child of God. You're just a pretender." Timothy walks away and starts crying, deeply hurt by the mockery of his powers. The two continue their journey together, and later that night, they stop at a place to rest. Josephine notices Timothy's wound worsening and insists that they need to treat it. Timothy then takes her to his home, where they meet an older man. The man asks, "Who is this?" Timothy replies, "She is my girlfriend." Josephine then asks Timothy, "Is this your father?" Timothy says nothing in response. The two resume their journey and eventually stop again to rest, continues to encourage him to seek proper treatment. As they travel together, Timothy starts to believe that Josephine has feelings for him. She says, "We need to get your wounds treated properly." They stop at various places but keep moving forward, and Josephine insists on finding a good doctor to help him. Finally, Timothy agrees, and they reach a doctor who, while at the doctor's place, Josephine notices police officers arriving. The police immediately arrest Timothy, but the police take him away. Josephine returns to her father, who is overjoyed to see her. Meanwhile, Timothy is interrogated by an officer. Timothy defends himself, saying, "That's not true. When I found Josephine, she was lonely and sad." The officer then brings in Josephine for questioning. The officer shows her a ring and asks, "Do you recognize this ring?" Josephine hesitates and cannot answer clearly, explaining that Timothy had once loved her, but later the officer now believes that Joseph is telling the truth. The case proceeds to court, where Joseph narrates everything before the judge. While leaving the courtroom, she glances at Timothy and smiles, and he smiles back. Timothy is sent to prison, where he starts thinking about Joseph and realizes his mistakes. The next day in court, Timothy confesses all his wrongdoings, and he is sentenced to 12 years in prison. Joseph returns home. A few days later, Joseph finds out that she is pregnant and eventually gives birth to Timothy's son. She decides to visit Timothy in prison one last time and informs him about their son. Timothy feels immense happiness upon hearing the news. After this meeting, Joseph leaves the prison and the movie concludes.